Rome was a civilization built on structure, order, and punishment. Its legions conquered continents, its laws inspired future nations, and its obsession with hierarchy dictated every facet of life, from the battlefield to the family home. But when that structure was violated from within, Rome responded with a brutality that defied comprehension. Today, we're diving into one of the most horrific punishments in ancient history, Poena Cullei. It was a penalty reserved for the worst crime a Roman could commit, patricide, the murder of one's own father. And the punishment, a ritual so disturbing, it involved being sewn into a leather sack with a snake, a dog, a monkey, and a rooster before being hurled into a river to drown in terror. This wasn't just execution, this was Roman justice at its most symbolic, theatrical, and terrifying. The Roman Empire owed much of its longevity to one key trait: organisation. In every aspect of life, from the structure of government to the structure of a household, Romans believed in hierarchy and control. Before Rome became an empire, it spent centuries as a republic ruled by a senate. But that senate wasn't for everyone. It was reserved for the patricians, the wealthiest, most influential families. The commoners, or plebeians, had their own councils to manage local affairs, like the Comita Centuria or the Concilium Plebis, but these assemblies were always under the shadow of the aristocracy. In Rome, class, status, and obedience shaped every citizen's role in society, and nowhere was this clearer than in the Roman family. At the top of the household stood the paterfamilias, the family's patriarch. Under Roman law, his power was absolute within the household. Through patria potestas, a foundational law which translates to the father's power, he controlled not just the finances and property of the family, but also the lives of his wife, children, and even grandchildren. This control extended beyond reason. A Roman father could disown his children, sell them into slavery, or even order their execution, all within his legal rights. Why such harsh authority? Because to the Romans, the family was a microcosm of the state. Order in the home reflected order in the republic, and to threaten that order was to threaten the foundation of Rome itself. So when that foundation was shattered by the unthinkable, when a child turned against their own father, Rome responded with a punishment as horrifying as the crime itself. This punishment is known as Poena Cullei, which translates in Latin to punishment of the sack. It may not sound scary, but there is nothing light-hearted about it. The ritual began with humiliation. The condemned was stripped of any identity, any dignity. His body was lashed with vergae sanguinae, which when translated to English means blood rods because of the crimson colour from the blood of the criminal. Over his head, a sack of wolf's hide was drawn tight. The wolf, a creature both revered and feared in Roman law, symbolised the beast the criminal had become. On his feet, clumsy wooden clogs were strapped, making movements slow, awkward, and pathetic. But this was just the beginning. The executioners would then prepare a massive leather sack. The sack was normally the size of a kitchen fridge. This was more than enough space for even the biggest of adult males, but that's because the criminal wasn't going to be alone in it. One by one, the companions of his death were added, each chosen with a symbolic cruelty. A venomous viper thought to murder its parents at birth. A rooster whose violent nature mirrored the parricide's betrayal. Then a dog was chosen because it was considered unclean and rabid by Roman standards. And worst of all, a monkey. Not because it was dangerous, because it was a grotesque reflection of the human form, and this was aimed to make a mockery of the man about to die. With all the creatures inside, the sack was sewn shut. No light, no sky, no mercy. But that wasn't the end of the punishment. There was more to it. The next part made it less of an act of penance and more of a death sentence. No one condemned to this punishment has ever survived, and here's why. With the criminal tied up in the sack with their companion, they were dragged by a cart to the edge of a river or sea, where they were thrown into the water. If the criminal didn't die from the dragging, the ruckus from all the terrified animals in the sack ought to do the job. But if they somehow managed to survive that, there was no way they could escape the treacherous depths of the water they were thrown into. In some cases they did float, but eventually everyone condemned to this punishment ended up on either the sea floor or the river bed. Each step in this form of execution wasn't just intended to be harsh, it was intended to symbolically show how the condemned had fractured the natural order and how it needed to be repaired. Even before death, The condemned was stripped of the most basic of nature's necessities. Air was denied, since they are suffocated within the sack. Earth was forbidden, as they were thrown into water, with no burial nor stone to mark where they lay. Their crime was simply too heinous for them to have a place among those who died honourably. Fire would not touch them, so no funeral flame and no spiritual cleansing, as their sin was seen to be irredeemable. And water? Water became the final executioner, not a baptism, but a grave. This form of punishment made beheading look like an act of mercy, and a punishment like this begged the question: how did the Romans concoct something this cruel? In the twilight of Rome's monarchy, around 509 BC, a chilling precedent was set under the reign of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the city's seventh and final king. The Sibylline books, a collection of prophetic writings, were acquired by Tarquinius from the Cumaean Sibyl. These texts were deemed so sacred that their contents were strictly guarded. They were consulted only during times of dire crisis. To guard these oracles, Tarquinius appointed 2 priests. Unfortunately, one of these guardians, Marcus Atilius, betrayed his sacred duty. He was accused of divulging the secrets of the Sibylline books to a foreigner named Petronius. As terrible as this wasn't his only crime. It was believed that his death didn't occur naturally. He was murdered, but it was who his murderer was that made things even more unbelievable. His own son, Atilius, was believed to be the murderer, and given what he had already done, no one could put such an act past him. For his transgressions, Atilius was subjected to a punishment as severe as his crimes. He was sewn into a leather sack and cast into the sea, a method of execution that would later inspire Poena Cullei. This act served as a stark warning. Betrayal of the divine and familial bonds would be met with the utmost severity. While this was not the Poena Cullei that was described earlier, it was clear that putting criminals in a sack was nothing new to the Romans, and neither was locking them up with animals. 4 centuries after Atilius's punishment, a man named Gaius Villus was set to be punished for supporting Tiberius Gracchus, a man whose reforms threatened to cause a revolution. Because of this, Gaius facing punishment was certain. However, what was debated was how and when his fate would be decided. He wasn't put in a sack and thrown into a body of water. Instead, he was locked into a vase. But he wasn't there alone, as there were venomous snakes of every kind thrown in with him, and just like Atilius's punishment, this would inspire part of what made Poena Cullei. It wouldn't be long before Poena Cullei became the fate of any Roman who dared take the life of their family member. In a society where pietas, the sacred duty to one's family, was the foundation of morality, the crime of parricide was seen not just as murder, but as a grotesque perversion of nature. It was the ultimate betrayal, a wound against the very soul of Rome. But for a long time, the law struggled to keep pace with the horror of the act. This was until one man, Publius Malleolus. In 90 BC, he was the first man whose only crime of parricide was sentenced to Poena Cullei. Upon his conviction, Malleolus underwent a grim ritual. His head was enveloped in a wolf's hide, symbolizing his transformation into a beast unworthy of human society. Wooden clogs were affixed to his feet, rendering escape impossible and signifying his detachment from the human world. He was then placed into a leather sack, which was sewn shut and cast into a body of water, ensuring his complete removal from the realm of the living. This execution marked the formal introduction of Poena Cullei into Roman law as the prescribed penalty for parricide. Soon after that, Poena Cullei became a custom. This was done with 2 key pieces of legislation: the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius, passed in 80s BC, and the Lex Pompeia de Parricidius, introduced around 55 BC. While the Lex Cornelia dealt broadly with assassins and poisoners, often prescribing exile as punishment, it was the Lex Pompeia that would finally make the crime of parricide unmistakable and unforgettable. Under this law, anyone who took the life of a parent, child, or close relative, whether by conspiracy or force, would suffer a punishment unlike any other. They were not to be executed by sword, burned, nor hanged. Instead, they were condemned to Poena Cullei. With how seriously parricide was taken, it made escaping the grim punishment very, very difficult, but not impossible. Sometimes the man who breaks the law in the worst possible way is the same man above it. Nero was an infamous emperor whose reign from 54 to 68 AD was marred by tyranny and bloodshed. Among his most heinous alleged crimes was the murder of his own mother, Agrippina the Younger. Nero's desire to eliminate his mother can be traced to his ascent to emperor, which ironically Agrippina ensured through her cunning ways. She married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, and convinced him to adopt Nero as his son, therefore making him heir to the throne. And when Nero was crowned as emperor, he wasn't really the one in charge. The person who put him there was, and she pulled the strings from behind the curtains. Nero was still a naive teenager, but as he aged he wanted his freedom, even if it would cost his mother her life. Nero orchestrated a sinister plot, a specially designed boat rigged to collapse and drown Agrippina. When she miraculously survived the maritime assassination attempt, he reportedly resorted to more direct means, ordering her execution under the guise of a suicide. Despite the gravity of matricide, Nero faced no formal prosecution. As emperor, he wielded absolute power, rendering him immune to the very laws that condemned such acts. The Roman Senate, subservient to his authority, dared not to challenge him, and the populace, though murmuring discontent, remained powerless. Instead, public sentiment turned to satire. Statues of Nero were defaced, one notably draped in a sack with a placard reading, "I have done what I could, but you deserve the sack." And if Nero wasn't just the emperor, history would have told of his death in a very horrific way. But not everybody got to be the emperor of Rome. So how did Sextus Roscius get acquitted for the death of his father, let alone a fair trial? Well, Sextus had Cicero, a young and outspoken lawyer, to thank for his life. Sextus Roscius was a simple man of Amarina, a town in Umbria, and the only son of a wealthy Roman landowner, also named Sextus Roscius. But when the elder Roscius was found brutally murdered in the streets of Rome, the finger of accusation turned sharply toward the son. But here's the twist. Sextus had nothing to gain from his father's death. In fact, he lost everything. The Roscius family estate, one of the richest in Ameria, was snatched up within days of the murder. No trial, no investigation, just silence and a signature. It didn't sit right with a young sharp lawyer named Marcus Tullius Cicero, who had a feeling that this was more than just a case of murder. He was right. The people who really gained from the elder Roscius' death weren't lurking in the shadows. They were sitting comfortably at Rome's highest tables. At the centre of it all, Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus, not a senator, not a soldier, but a freedman turned kingmaker, and the favourite agent of the dictator Sulla. He wasn't a brute with a dagger, he was worse. Chrysogonus ran Sulla's prescriptions, a purge where names were listed, men declared enemies of the state, and their fortunes legally stolen. After Roscius was murdered, Chrysogonus added his name even though he was already dead. Just like that, Roscius became an enemy of Rome, and his land, worth millions, was bought by Chrysogonus for a fraction of its value. But he didn't work alone. Two men helped him pull it off: Titus Roscius Magnus and Titus Roscius Capito, distant cousins of Sextus. They were the only ones who handled the dirty work, whispering lies in court, pushing the accusation that Sextus had murdered his own father, and when it was over, Capito walked away with a hefty slice of the estate. It was a perfect setup. Blame the son, bury the truth, split the spoils. And Cicero? He was expected to stay quiet. He was young, untested, and going up against men who could destroy him with a word was suicide. But he didn't blink. When Cicero stepped into that courtroom, he didn't just argue, he exposed. He ripped through the lies, laid the conspiracy bare, and pointed his finger straight at Chrysogonus. His words turned the room cold. He didn't just defend Sextus, he accused the empire itself, and against all odds, the jury listened. Sextus Roscius walked free, and Cicero walked out a legend. But between a tyrannical leader and an innocent man who escaped Poena Cullei, there were plenty of cases over the centuries of people who died in the sack. The truth is, parricide was at an all-time high, so during this time, Poena Cullei didn't just become rampant, but more gruesome. The formal authorization of Poena Cullei is attributed to Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BC to 14 BC. Although its practice predates his reign, under Augustus the punishment became institutionalized, symbolizing the state's commitment to upholding familial sanctity. By the time Emperor Claudius was ruler in 41 AD, the use of the sack had become alarmingly frequent, and crucifixion was now the second most popular form of execution after Poena Cullei. It was from this period that Poena Cullei started to feature animals being thrown into the sack with criminals, but not every Roman emperor was fond of this method of executing people. By the 1st century AD, Emperor Hadrian made the punishment optional, offering alternatives such as being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. By the late 3rd century AD, the jurist Paulus noted that the sack had fallen out of use, replaced by methods like burning alive or being eaten by animals in the amphitheatre. For the next 2 years, it would seem like Poena Cullei was slowly fading out of existence, until its renaissance in 306 AD, when Emperor Constantine ascended to the throne. The fact that he was a Christian led many to believe that he would eradicate it and lean more on the side of mercy. But instead, the only thing his faith inspired was for him to have snakes as the only animal in the sack with the criminal. But what happened to Poena Cullei after Rome fell? When the Roman Empire came to an end, Poena Cullei didn't exactly suffer the same fate. It was the 5th century AD, and the Eternal City, once the engine of a mighty empire, groaned under the weight of its own decay. The Western Roman Empire, battered by economic collapse, military overreach, and the relentless pounding of barbarian invasions, fractured like old marble. In Constantinople, the Roman legacy lived on under a new name, the Byzantine Empire. Greek in language but Roman in law and identity, so this meant one thing: Poena Cullei was still very much practiced, even though barely. By the 9th century, even the Byzantines began to shy away from what had been their custom for a very long time. Under Emperor Leo VI, the Wise, the basilica replaced the sack with the stake. Poena Cullei, it seemed, had been buried by time, but evil has a way of crawling back. In Germany, the practice was revived literally. The 12th century Sachsenspiegel, a German legal code, prescribed a terrifying variation. The monkey was replaced with a cat, the rooster sometimes omitted, and the snake only represented on paper. The sack, now made of linen, allowed water to seep in, hastening drowning. In some cases, to prolong agony, a leather sack coated with pitch was used, causing death by suffocation. A grim account from Dresden tells of such a sack bursting upon hitting the water, allowing the animals to escape while the man drowned. But it wasn't just the Germans who were executing people in sacks. In 13th century Spain, under King Alfonso X of Castile, the Poena Cullei resurfaced symbolically in the Siete Partidas, a comprehensive legal code. While the actual drowning ceased, the ritual lived on. Parricides were paraded in disgrace, tied to beasts of burden, placed in barrels adorned with the images of the dreaded animals, and symbolically cast into imagined waters before burial. The last known execution occurred in Saxony in 1734, though some sources suggest it was in the city of Zittau in 1749. In these final acts, the condemned were sealed in black sacks, accompanied by animals, and submerged for hours, sometimes to the haunting strains of hymns. The practice was officially abolished in Saxony on June 17, 1761. Since Saxony, there has never been any mention of it being used again. Capital punishments have evolved to be as easy and efficient as possible, and in today's modern law, parricide isn't treated any differently from other cases of homicide. And there is no greater form of symbolism of justice than a criminal facing justice, so no meanings have to be attached to how they get punished. Poena Cullei wouldn't be known today as part of Roman culture if it weren't attached to the terrible crime for which it served as a consequence. Even at that, several texts from different accounts of Roman history had to be put together to paint the picture of what Poena Cullei really was and what it meant to the Romans. It was almost like it was a punishment too insane for the history books, because there is no greater irony than the fact that one of the most advanced and developed civilizations of its time had one of the most barbaric forms of punishment.